Everyone knows Dr. Paul as the beloved veterinarian from The Incredible Dr. Paul. But almost nobody knows what his son Charles has been quietly carrying behind every single camera he ever pointed at his father. Charles built this show from nothing. He gave Dr. Paul his legacy, and while he was doing that, two terrible things happened to him that he buried so deep. A death so sudden that the family that lived on camera refused to say a single word about it. And a devastating question about his own identity that he has been trying to answer his entire life without ever once asking it out loud. This is the story he never told, and it will break your heart completely. Who Charles Paul really is. If you have ever watched The Incredible Dr. Paul, you think you know Charles Paul. He is the man who laughs a little too hard at his own jokes and keeps the energy bouncing whenever the camera swings his way. He is warm and always seems to be having the time of his life. But here is where things get genuinely strange, because people who always act cheerful are almost never as happy as they look. The question that nobody asks is what the performance is covering. Charles Paul was not born a Paul. He was adopted. Dr. Jan Paul and his wife Diane brought Charles into their family and gave him their name, their home, and their world. In the simplest telling, that is a beautiful story. A child chosen by a family who wanted him. But the simplest telling is not always the most honest one. And this story requires honesty. Charles has never spoken about his biological parents. Not a name, not a detail, not a single word about where he came from before the Pauls found him. That might seem like a personal choice, and in isolation, maybe it is. But here is what makes it genuinely unsettling. Charles Paul is the executive producer of the show. He is the man who decided what got filmed, what got aired, and what America got to see. And across more than 200 episodes, the Paul family led America into everything. And yet the man controlling every single camera has maintained an absolute unbroken silence about his own origins. That silence is not nothing. That silence is telling you something. What Charles actually built with his career is something that deserves far more attention than it gets. He did not inherit Dr. Paul's fame, he created it. He came up with the concept for the show, he pitched it, and he sold it to Nat Geo Wild at a time when nobody was lining up to make a reality show about a country veterinarian in Weidman, Michigan. He has executive produced every season across more than a decade. Without Charles Paul, Dr. Jan Paul is simply a very skilled vet that nobody outside of mid-Michigan has ever heard of. Charles took his father and gave him a legacy that millions of people across the world now recognize. He built the stage, he designed it, and then he spent his entire career standing just off of it. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable in a way that is hard to shake. Watch the show carefully across its seasons and something becomes quietly visible. Dr. Paul's biological grandchildren receive warm, extended, and emotionally rich airtime. The camera lingers on them. The show celebrates them. Charles's own family, his wife Beth, his separate life, receives brief acknowledgement and is treated mostly as background. Now hold that detail in your mind and remember who makes these decisions. Charles is the executive producer. He approved every single frame you have ever watched. The version of the Paul family that exists in the minds of millions of people around the world is a version that Charles himself constructed. And in that version, the one he built with his own hands, his branch of the family sits consistently at the edge of the frame. There are two ways to understand that. Either Charles made a deliberate professional choice to protect his private life from the cameras he controls, which is completely reasonable, or on some level he may never have fully examined, he internalized the belief that his story was less central to the Paul legacy than the stories of the biological line. Both explanations are uncomfortable. One of them is heartbreaking. Dr. Paul is famously old-school Dutch, raised in a culture where emotions are not discussed, where problems are worked through rather than talked through, and where emotional reserve is not a weakness but a form of strength. That household shaped Charles across years of daily modeling. It taught him that the correct response to pain is forward motion, that the correct response to grief is productivity, that the correct response to fracture is a smile and a joke and getting back to work. He learned to laugh instead of grieve. He learned it so thoroughly and for so long that it stopped feeling like a learned behavior and simply became who he was. Within the Paul family, Charles became the person who holds things together when they begin to crack, the shock absorber, the one who keeps smiling so that everyone else has permission to keep going. It is one of the loneliest positions a human being can occupy, and he has held it for decades, without a break, without anyone ever turning the camera around to ask how he is actually doing. But to understand how heavy that role truly became, you need to understand what was about to happen. Because the show Charles built was never just a career move. It was something far more personal than that. And the price of building it, the real price, the one that never showed up in any production budget, would take years to fully reveal itself. The price of building his father's empire. The Incredible Dr. Paul is a genuine success story. By every standard that the television industry uses to measure these things, the show is a remarkable achievement. But here is the thing about success that nobody puts in the press releases. It always has a price. And the price Charles paid for this particular success was not financial, and it was not professional. It was personal, and it was quiet. And it was extracted from him year after year in ways that the cameras, despite being everywhere, never once captured. The Incredible Dr. Paul attracted serious, formal, documented accusations of animal cruelty from licensed veterinary professionals. Not squeamish viewers who were uncomfortable watching farm medicine. Not online commenters reacting emotionally. Credentialed professionals who watched the show and filed formal complaints with the American Veterinary Medical Association and with state veterinary boards. They identified procedures being performed without adequate pain management. They flagged surgical techniques that the broader veterinary profession had moved away from. They looked at what was being broadcast to millions of viewers on a major network and called it, in professional and legal language, a big problem. Now understand what that means for Charles. These were professional indictments of the show he built and of the methods of the man he had dedicated his entire career to celebrating. Every single one of those complaints landed on Charles's desk. He went in front of cameras and microphones and publicly defended the content while being intelligent enough to understand, because a man who built a television empire from scratch is not a man who lacks self-awareness, that some of what his father was being criticized for was real. And he defended him anyway, every time, without hesitation. Because Charles was built to be the one who absorbs the hits, so Dr. Paul never had to. The second place the price showed up is something almost nobody outside the reality television industry knows. The Incredible Dr. Paul came remarkably close to ending before it ever became the institution it is today. Reality television is a ratings-driven business with very little sentimentality. Nat Geo Wild is not a network that carries underperforming content out of loyalty. There were periods across the show's run where the numbers dipped and the network's enthusiasm cooled, and the future of the entire Paul television enterprise was genuinely uncertain in a way that Charles could not share publicly and could not fully put down privately either. Charles lived inside that uncertainty in a way that went far beyond normal professional anxiety. Because for Charles, the show ending was never just a career setback. The show ending meant his father's story stops. Every ratings report he read carried that weight. Every season renewal conversation carried it. Every network meeting where the future of the show was on the table was, for Charles, a meeting about the future of the most important relationship in his life. And during at least one of those renewal negotiations, according to reports from within reality television industry circles, network executives pushed for significant format changes that would have fundamentally altered what the show was. Changes that Dr. Paul resisted, which placed Charles directly between network demands he could not ignore and his father's wishes he could not betray. A son and a producer, caught between the two greatest authorities in his life, with the only name he had ever truly and fully claimed as his own, sitting on the negotiating table between them. He held it together. He found a path through. He always did. But the cost of holding it together across years of that kind of pressure is not the kind of thing that gets acknowledged in an Emmy nomination. While all of this was happening professionally, Charles was trying to build something that actually belonged to him. He and his wife Beth began working toward a farm project, something with Charles's name on it rather than his father's. A quiet and deliberate attempt to construct an identity that existed outside the Pole brand, outside the show, outside the role of invisible architect and devoted son. It kept getting deferred. Production schedules, promotional demands, the relentless operational weight of a television empire that does not stop because one of its key people needs a moment to breathe. The farm kept getting pushed back. The personal dream kept being moved to a back burner. And then, right at the moment the farm project was beginning to feel genuinely real, right as Charles and Beth were emotionally and practically investing in something that was finally theirs, Beth's father died. This was not a Pole family loss. It was not something the show would address or the audience would be told about or the network would need to manage. This was Charles's grief, in his own home, with his own wife, in the life he had been trying to build apart from the camera. Their loss, quiet and private and real, landed at the exact moment they were reaching towards something hopeful. Charles absorbed it, managed it, kept the show running. Because that is the only response he has ever been given permission to have. That is all he has ever known how to do. 2019, the year the walls came down. There are years that rearrange a person. It arrives without warning and leaves you permanently different in ways you could not have predicted and cannot fully undo. The kind of year that finds every crack in every wall you have ever built around yourself and applies pressure to each one simultaneously. For Charles Paul, 2019 was that year. To understand what 2019 meant for Charles, you first have to understand who Adam Butch was. Adam was Kathleen's son, Dr. Paul's biological grandson, Charles's nephew. He appeared on The Incredible Dr. Paul as part of the next generation of the family on screen, part of the living evidence that the Paul story was continuing beyond Dr. Paul and Diane, that what they had built was being inherited and carried forward. He was 23 years old. He was the kind of 23 that feels boundless, where everything is still open and nothing has been foreclosed, and the whole future is still entirely available. He was not a peripheral figure in Charles's life. He was family. Someone Charles knew, had watched grow up, loved in the quiet, sustained way that families love people they have shared years with. In 2019, Adam Butch died. What happened next is one of the most revealing things this family has ever done, and they did not do it on camera. They did the opposite. The Pauls released a brief statement acknowledging the loss and asked for privacy. And then the silence came down. Total, immediate, carefully maintained silence around the circumstances of Adam's death. No episode dedicated to the grief. No tearful on-camera tribute of the kind that reality television almost reflexively produces when a beloved family member dies. No details offered to an audience that had followed this family for years and genuinely felt, in the way reality TV audiences do, that they knew these people. The cause of death was never publicly disclosed. Now hold that against what you know about this family. Over 200 episodes. Cameras inside the surgery, inside the kitchen, inside the barn at 4 in the morning. A family whose entire television identity was built on the premise of letting America in, of radical and unfiltered openness. And when a 23-year-old member of that family died suddenly, the cameras went completely dark on it. The details were locked away and have stayed locked away. When a young man dies suddenly at 23, and a family that lives on camera will not say how, that silence is not simply grief. It is a deliberate decision, a specific, sustained, carefully maintained editorial choice made by the person who makes editorial choices for the Pole family. Charles decided what the audience was allowed to know. He pointed the camera away from something, and he has kept it pointed away every single day since. We do not know what he was protecting his family from. We only know that he protected them completely, and that whatever it cost him to hold that particular silence, he paid it alone, behind the camera, where nobody could see it on his face. Here is the detail that stays with you longest after everything else fades. The incredible Dr. Paul did not stop after Adam died. There was no extended pause in production, no hiatus while the family found their footing in grief. The show continued. Episodes were completed, seasons were delivered. The warm, cheerful, beloved world of Dr. Paul's Michigan veterinary practice kept appearing on screens across America, on schedule, as promised, as contracted. Charles kept the machine running. He was making editorial decisions, managing production crews, and handling network obligations, keeping every moving part of a major television enterprise in motion, and he was doing all of it while privately carrying the death of a 23-year-old boy he had watched grow up. The audience who watched those post-2019 episodes saw exactly what they always saw. Dr. Paul smiling, working, healing animals, cracking dry jokes in his Dutch accent. They had no idea. They had absolutely no idea what was sitting inside the man behind the camera, making sure every frame was where it needed to be. Charles had spent his entire life learning not to show the fracture. In the Paul household, you keep moving. You work through it. You do not perform your grief. You absorb it and convert it into forward motion. In 2019, he deployed every skill that 20-plus years of that training had given him, and the show went on. What does that cost a person? What actually happens inside someone who has been conditioned since childhood to suppress, who then has to actively manage the warm and upbeat production of a beloved family television show while grief is sitting inside them like a stone they have to carry from room to room? What accumulates in a man who has no real mechanism for release, no permission to publicly fall apart, no framework for his grief that does not immediately convert itself into productivity? The audience never saw it. That was the point. That was Charles doing his job, the job of keeping the show alive and Dr. Paul's image intact, with a level of personal cost that no production credit will ever adequately reflect. It was the best and most devastating performance of his career. And nobody applauded it, because nobody knew it was happening. Watching the legend fade, Dr. Paul and Diane's decline, and what it is doing to Charles. There is a specific kind of grief that is nameless. It is the grief of watching someone you love become incrementally less than they were, watching the edges soften and the pace slow, and the invincibility that you took completely for granted begin to crack in ways that cannot be reversed. For Charles Paul, that grief now has two faces. Dr. Paul has never slowed down willingly. This is foundational to his identity and to the show's identity. The old-school Dutch farmer vet who outworks men half his age, who performs physically brutal large animal procedures in brutal Michigan winters, who has never once responded to a challenge by stepping back. The audience loves this about him and has always loved it. His relentlessness is not incidental to the show. It is the show. The whole premise rests on it. But Dr. Paul is aging. It is visible if you watch across the seasons with clear eyes. And Charles does not watch as a viewer. He watches as a son, and as the executive producer responsible for every single frame. From that dual vantage point, the aging carries a weight that no audience member can access. Charles has almost certainly sat in rooms with network executives, with other producers, possibly with Diane alone, having conversations about how long Dr. Paul can realistically continue, about the physical risks of a man his age performing this kind of work on camera, about what happens to the show, to the brand, to the entire carefully constructed structure, when Dr. Paul can no longer do what the show requires him to do. Those conversations are among the most painful any son has ever been required to participate in, because they are not production planning conversations. They are conversations about when your father's story ends, about who is responsible for managing that timeline, about whether the son who built the stage is now the one who has to decide when the curtain comes down. And Dr. Paul will never be the one to initiate that conversation. Men shaped by the values that shaped Dr. Paul do not admit limits. They push through. They let the work answer every question about their capacity, which means Charles has to watch. He has to assess, has to form judgments about his father's well-being that his father would never invite and might actively resist. The producer in Charles manages this. The son in Charles is quietly devastated by it every single day. Then came Diane's emergency back surgery, and it arrived the way emergencies always do, without warning and without any consideration for whether the person it strikes is ready. One day she was fully present, the anchor of the household, the woman who had held the Paul family together through decades of demanding work and public scrutiny. And next thing, she was in a surgical suite and nothing was certain. The following account has circulated through the inner circles of the Paul family, whispered from a close confidant to a friend, then passed like a heavy secret from one soul to the next until the weight of it reached the light of day. Charles sat in the waiting room when the nurse appeared with a clipboard. "Are you her son?" "Yes," Charles said. He did not pause. He did not reach for the word or measure it or decide whether it fit. It came out the way breathing comes out. The nurse nodded and walked away and left him alone with what he had just done. Charles sat with the echo of that yes. He felt a sudden, sharp vertigo, the cost of such ease. To claim her so effortlessly was to acknowledge how completely his identity was anchored to the woman currently under a surgeon's knife. If she vanished, the yes would have nowhere to land. He wasn't just terrified of her death. He was terrified of the erasure of the only map he had ever used to find himself. Then, he took out his phone. The pressure in his chest became a physical demand for air, or perhaps for an anchor. Charles pulled his phone from his pocket. His thumb hovered over the contacts, searching for a name, anyone who could pull him out of the vacuum of the waiting room. He wanted to call, to hear a voice that wasn't his own, but his thumb went still. He realized that if he called, they would ask the impossible question. "How are you holding up?" He could not figure out what to say back. Not because the feelings were absent. They were not absent. They were the loudest thing in the room. But to explain how he was holding up would require explaining why this particular waiting room felt different from anything he had words for. He would have to explain that he wasn't just losing a mother, but the very proof of his legitimacy. He would have to find words for the way her existence acted as a shield, protecting him from the labor of explaining his own belonging. For his entire life, Diane's presence meant he never had to provide evidence for his place in the world. He just was. He did not know how to say that to someone in a phone call. He put the phone back in his pocket. He folded his hands. He waited. Charles managed it the way he manages everything. Quietly, professionally, without showing the fracture, without letting the camera anywhere near what it would have found if it had turned around and looked at him directly. And now the show itself is winding down. This is not speculation. A show that has run for over a decade is approaching its natural conclusion, and the audience can sense it, and industry observers can see it, and Charles, who has always understood the shape of the thing better than anyone, has certainly understood it longest. For most television producers, a show ending is a career transition. You develop the next project. You pivot. You build something new. For Charles, the show ending is something closer to an identity rupture, because the show is not his career. It is the structure that gave his relationship with Dr. Paul its most tangible and publicly undeniable expression. Every season renewed was confirmation that Charles belonged in this family. Every episode delivered was evidence that he was essential, irreplaceable, the person without whom none of this exists. Every viewer who tuned in was, in some indirect way, validation that the decision Charles made to dedicate his life to his father's story had been the right one and had mattered to the world. When the show ends, Charles does not simply lose a job. He loses the primary arena in which he was, completely and without any ambiguity, his father's son. What remains after that is the question Charles has been circling his whole life. The one he built the show partly to avoid having to answer. And now it is coming. The silence on the other side of the final episode is going to be louder than anything he has ever had to sit with. The wound beneath everything, the adoption, the legacy, and the truth about what Charles really needed. The story of Charles Paul began with an adoption. It's actually pretty heavy when you realize he spent over 10 years filming his family's authentic life while being the most guarded person there. He's the one who decided what the general public saw and what stayed on the cutting room floor. All the real stuff, the exhaustion, the actual arguments, his own grief, he just kept in storage. It's like he worked himself to the bone to make sure his parents became these legendary figures. But in the process, he kind of erased himself. He made sure everyone else looked good and felt loved. But he was so good at his job that nobody ever stopped to ask him how he was actually holding up. He's basically a ghost in his own life story, making sure the Paul name lives on while he just stays the producer in the background. Here is the quiet devastation that nobody in the Paul universe has ever addressed directly. The Paul legacy, not the television one that Charles built, but the real one, the living one, the one that continues in daily life after the cameras are packed away, flows through biological lineage, the land, the veterinary practice, the name carried into future generations by people who share Dr. Paul's blood, Kathleen's children, the biological grandchildren who inherit the Paul story in the oldest and deepest sense a legacy can be inherited. Charles Paul is still here, still producing, still showing up, still performing the cheerfulness that the show and the family and the audience have always needed from him. The losses have accumulated in ways that would have leveled a different person. Adam, gone at 23 with the circumstances locked away. Beth's father, taken at the exact moment something hopeful was being built. Diane, suddenly fragile in a surgical suite. Dr. Paul, visibly aging toward a limit he will never acknowledge. The show itself, winding toward an ending that will take with it the primary structure through which Charles's place in this family was made permanent and visible and undeniably real. But there is a question that has never been asked of Charles Paul in any interview, on any episode, anywhere in the long public record of this family's very documented life. Was it enough? Did he ever feel, in the most honest and unperformed part of himself, that he fully and completely and without any remaining shadow of doubt belonged to this family? Not as a producer, and not as an executive, and not as the invisible architect of everything the Paul name now means to the world, but as a son. Just a son. Simply and completely and without needing to earn it again tomorrow. Did Dr. Paul ever look at Charles, away from the cameras and the show and the brand and everything Charles had built and maintained and defended, and say the thing that Charles may have needed to hear since the very first day he was brought into that family? I see you. Not what you built, not what you managed, not the walls you held and the grief you absorbed, and the fractures you hid and the dreams you put aside year after year to keep my story going. I see you, and you were always enough. Before the show, before the cameras, before you had built a single thing. You were always already mine. We do not know if that moment ever happened. There is no footage of it. No interview where it was captured. No episode where it aired. And that silence, that single, specific, unrecorded silence, after everything you now know about this man's life, may be the most devastating thing in the entire story. Charles Paul gave his father forever. The only question that remains, the one this story cannot answer because Charles has never answered it himself, is whether he ever truly felt, in return, that he had been given a place where he simply and permanently and unconditionally belonged. The tragedy of Dr. Paul's son is not one event. It is not a death, or a surgery, or a show ending, or a dream deferred. It is a man who spent his entire life making sure everyone else was seen, and never once asked to be seen himself. And it is still happening.